Hi, this is Lynn with Tucson Unified School District. Thank you for listening to this training. This training is for the school year, fiscal year 23, and is regarding Tucson Unified School District private school participation in Title I services. I want to start by talking about the intent of Title I services in private schools, just to make sure that we're all on the same page about how Title I services may be used and what they are intended to do. So Title I services are to provide instructional services to eligible students, and that word eligible is very important. It is a targeted program, meaning that it provides targeted tutoring services to improve academic outcomes for those eligible students. Overall, this training is going to provide you information about nuts and bolts, how funds are allocated to Title I schools, how students are identified for Title I programs, and what information is necessary to operate those programs. If you are a site administrator experienced in the process and protocols for operating a Title I program with TUSD, some important updates for you are colored. Well, you can't run a program without some money to set aside to run it. So let's talk about how service dollars are derived for private schools. And it's really a simple formula. Basically, we have to have poverty information. So Title I funds follow students and families and are always 1 year behind the current school year. So in other words, student counts that you give us for poverty students in January will be allocated for the following fiscal year, which starts in July. So Title I funds are allocated to private schools based on their eligible poverty students. And we get a gross per pupil allocation. So basically the Title I funds that are allocated to private school students are the same as those that are allocated to the eligible district students. We multiply the total number of private school students by the gross per pupil allocation, which gives me the total amount of private school funds for tutoring. From that fund or that general pool, we deduct valid program administration costs, both direct and indirect, which are directly attributable to serving private schools. And this determines an adjusted per pupil allocation. I'm going to go through this some more with you on the next slide. But what are those valid administrative costs? The indirect is a state-approved indirect rate. It varies from year to year, and it applies to all the grants that belong within a district. And every single school district will have a different indirect rate. So even if you are participating with other districts, you cannot assume that their indirect rate is the same as ours, because they never are exactly the same. Direct administrative costs are those costs that can be directly traced to administering a program, in this case, the private school programs. So these are costs that would not exist if Tucson Unified were not administering private school programs. Those costs are taken off of the top of the private school pool. There are also some costs that are shared across the program, such as programmatic assessment and program supplies. We used to take those off the top. We no longer do. What we have been instructed by Arizona Department of Ed to do is to allocate those funds to schools, and then we deduct them from the school allocation to cover things that are shared amongst multiple school students. We then take the adjusted per pupil allocation and we multiply it by the number of eligible students that were identified at each private school to determine each private school's individual service allocation. So here is a chart that breaks out exactly what I was just talking about. So TUSD's preliminary Title I allocation this year is $20 million. Our indirect rate is 6.27%. The number of poverty eligible students in the district is 30,254, and the number of poverty eligible private school students was 1,058, which gives us a total student count for poverty students of 31,312. We divide that number of students into that preliminary allocation, which gives us a gross per pupil allocation of $638.90. We multiplied that by that 1,058, which gave us a gross allocable to private schools of $675,950, and this is dollars worth of services. We also then take the indirect, which amounts to $23,214.11. Indirect includes things that are basically costs of doing business. So that would be electricity and utilities and the cost of our human resource department and our finance department and all those people who help us process all the paperwork for you all. The direct cost in this case for the Title I private schools only is $152,855. Included in that, I do want to make a special note, includes a printer photocopier for $9,000. This is actually a required consultation topic, so I want to talk to you about why that $9,000 is in there. That $9,000 is in there because last year during summer school, we had to print a significant number of student materials. And in so doing, we were tying up the office photocopier printer to the point where a lot of people couldn't print. And we were running the photocopier printer for about 3.5 to 4 weeks, 6 days a week, probably about 12 hours a day, and we were not able to keep up with the printing demands. So at that point, we actually had to contract out probably the final 25% of the copying, and that bill came in at a little over $2,000. So based on the cost of that, we decided that over the long term, it would be cheaper for us to get our own dedicated photocopier printer a little faster in speed so that we are not tying up the department's copier and that we are able to copy everything we need in-house. Anyway, with all of those deductions, it leaves an adjusted allocation to private schools of $517,595. We have a family engagement set aside, which is a minimum of 1%. So for that is $5,500, which leaves us dividing all of that by the number of 1,058 left us an adjusted per pupil allocation for each private school student that was eligible at your site of $489.22. I also want to point out that this is a preliminary allocation. We are expecting an increase of roughly 10%, maybe a little more when final allocations come in. When final allocations come in, you will receive a formal allocation letter which will have a table just like this on it with all the updated information. What's not going to change on that is the number of students and the indirect rate. I also am not really expecting to see a change in the direct cost, so any kind of increase that we see to the fund is all going to go to the per pupil allocation. So how service allocations are derived is really important. So I just want to talk a little bit more about that. What are qualifying low-income students? So these are students that if they were attending public school would be eligible for free or reduced lunch. Many private schools don't have a national nutrition program, which is fine. You do not have to have that to participate in Title I funds, but private schools must be able to provide documentation of income eligibility. We also need their home address because not every school in every district is a Title I school. And if the student is meeting the income eligibility, but their home school is not a Title I school, that student would not generate funding for you because the logic is that we are going to generate funding for students who at their home school, their home public school, would be eligible and be receiving Title I services. So in order to receive funding for students, students have to be both in a Title I homeschool attendance area and meet eligibility for poverty. In order to receive Title I services, students must still reside in that Title I attendance area, going back to that idea of if they were attending their home public school, would they be receiving services if they needed them? And the answer to that, of course, would be yes. for receiving or being eligible for tutoring, poverty is not a criteria. What is a criteria is that we serve the most academically needy students in the order of academic need, and that academic need has to be substantiated by norm reference national data. So this is often a challenge. We do need that data along with those students' home addresses so that we know which students qualify for Title I tutoring. Private schools must provide academic data about prospective Title I students so that LEAs or districts can rank and prioritize students in order of academic need. I want to make it clear here. It is the district who provides the ranking and the selection of the students. It is not the private school. Also, we would need academic data on all students who are eligible. We don't necessarily need data for students who are not eligible because they're not eligible for services in any case. But what we do find is that many parents and/or private school administrators do not know. So I just want to make it clear that we do need data for any eligible student so that we can have a full picture and rank students according to academic need. Again, standardized assessment data must be used for all students grades K-12, which normally would mean that we cannot begin a kinder program until data is present for all eligible students. There are a few exceptions, but they're usually not worth mentioning here. If you have questions about that, please contact me. Teacher recommendations may be used as a small part of the student selection or ranking process. Notice that I said may be used and small part. So Arizona Department of Ed has been very clear that the largest weight in student selection must be based on that standardized assessment data. And if teachers want to provide recommendations, they can, and those are factored in before we rank kids, but they cannot be the largest part of the selection process. The LEA or the district then selects students to be served based on their academic priority and the program design. So what that means is that if your school is only having a kinder through third grade program, we would not be selecting any fourth grade students for you regardless of their need because your program is a K-3 program. I also want to make sure that private schools understand that TUSD is not holding a professional development set aside in Title I-A. I found that it was inequitably used, is not really something that private schools can largely use because it's really for the tutors of the kids that are serving those Title I kids. So it just was hard to use, and I just didn't think it was worth holding money from kids for. Family engagement funds, that minimum 1% is set aside, and those are to provide academic support, engage and educate families of active Title I students only. And what that means is only students who are receiving tutoring. They do not have to be low-income families. They have to be the parents, families of students that are actively in the tutoring program, not the ones who qualify, but the ones who are actually receiving tutoring. So again, I told you that these were preliminary Title I allocations. Preliminary allocations are always estimates. Schools should plan for all preliminary allocations that they have. We would allow schools to encumber up to 100% of the total planned allocation. And this is different than Titles 2 and 4 because even though the allocation isn't final, even if it were to drop, which we're not at all expecting, we know that we would not have spent all of that allocation because Title I is paid out as it is, as the services are delivered. So we know that going through the course of a year, we will have time to make any corrections that are needed by any final allocation adjustments. Family engagement set-asides should be part of the school planning and are taken from within the site allotments. I do want to spend a moment and talk about tutoring vendors. Private schools are never to reveal federal service funding allocations to vendors for any title. While consideration is given to school wishes in how tutoring is provided and who provides that tutoring, final decisions regarding the use of tutors and vendors is strictly within the realm of the district, and that is because it is a district program and the district is responsible for managing the funding. I ask that you avoid any appearance of impropriety in your relationships with vendors. Vendors' relationships regarding tutoring with private school really is between the districts and the vendor. Vendors are not to set tutoring schedules or select students or provide you any other information about how you can use your Title I funds, because these really aren't your Title I funds. They are Title I funds for the students that are attending your school, and they are managed by the districts. Much of the work in setting up a Title I program is in the program design. And so the elements of the program design are, where is the Title I program service being given? Normally that is at the private school. If for whatever reason a private school wanted those services to be delivered elsewhere, all of the transportation and costs of providing those services off-site would come out of the private school allocation and would dwindle those funds very quickly. When and how? When will services begin and end? Arizona Department of Ed and Department of Ed really want to see services early in the year. They don't really like summer school programs, so it's really unpopular for schools to say, I'm saving my Title I money for a summer program. This year's money is for this year's kids, and you have to always remember that when they are thinking about any federal program, what's in the mind of legislators and the agencies that set up the rules around this is really public schools. And as we all know, public schools have those high stakes assessments in the spring. And in their mind, these programs are designed to provide supplemental tutoring services before those high stakes assessments come in the spring so that students can do better. So when and how, we'll ask you to provide a schedule in a format outlined in the needs assessment, and that includes tutoring by grade levels, by content. What is the precise student schedule you are proposing? Title I tutoring must always be supplemental to core instruction. Students must receive all core instruction with their regular classroom teachers and cannot be pulled out of either English language arts or mathematics to attend tutoring. Preferably also not science. Because of this, I advise schools to stagger literacy and math blocks amongst the grades so that any supplemental tutoring then can waterfall as well throughout the day. To improve program staffing, we ask that you schedule all tutoring as a 4-hour block without any breaks. And this is just because it is so hard to find staff that I really struggle to find staff unless I can guarantee them 4 hours a day. People just don't feel it's worth it. Most of these people are retirees and they only work part-time. And if they can't get at least 4 hours, it's simply not worth their drive and effort to work. So I find that if I can provide them a 4-hour block without any breaks, then my chances of getting tutors out to your schools is so much better. I also want to let you know that while some schools really desire after-school programs, I do not enthusiastically support them, and I will encourage or advocate for during-the-day school programs as much as possible for a few reasons. After-school programs are not ideal as students' attendance is unreliable. Often students have sports or other activities or their rides, and the attendance is not great. Also, the younger children are just simply very, very tired by the end of a school day, so after-school tutoring is not as effective for them. If a school, for whatever reason, and one valid reason might be that they simply have no space during the day to provide tutoring, can only provide an after-school program, I do want to let you know up front, because of the short time frame, they are typically best staffed by private school teachers who are also employed through TUSD. Because again, it goes back to that idea that nobody wants to leave their home for 1.5, and usually even 2 hours of tutoring. The pay just doesn't pay for their gas and trouble. Federal guidance states that Title I services should begin as close as possible to the time that districts begin services, and that goes back to that early intervention is preferred. So they really want to see that districts are not slow to provide services to private school partners, and they really want to see that early intervention. So I do want to put that out there that anytime we have services that are beginning much later than district services, it brings up questions about why did this happen. I also want to let you know that as part of the logistical consideration, finalized tutoring schedules must be received at least 45 days prior to a proposed commencement of tutoring services. We also will need the student data, which I will talk about in a moment. So who is receiving student services? Students' place in academic need must be determined before students can be ranked and selected and before program services may begin. So this goes back to what I was just saying. Tucson Unified School District needs at least 3 weeks to process information about student eligibility and selection. Where does a student fall in the ranking sequence? Are they eligible for services? All students who are in Title I tutoring programs must have signed permission forms in place before they may attend tutoring. And I also need to know at that time what is the scheduled date for parent orientation to the Title I program. Ideally, we would have this information so that we could have this happen at the same time as the private school's back to school night. What does your site needs assessment, i.e. your student data, reveal about student needs? What are the highest needs of content needs and in what grade levels? So we're really looking traditionally at English language arts and mathematics. And we also want to look at all the grade levels and the content. Sometimes schools will say, well, I only wanted to do a K-3 program, but when we look at 4th or 5th grade data, decide that we really need to have a 4th and 5th grade program as well. So it's really important to look at the content and all the grade levels. How does the school prefer the program be staffed? Again, is that going to be through TUSD employed tutors, which is usually the best option as it provides the most hours of tutoring as the costs are lower, or does the school prefer a vendor? Again, do not contact vendors directly, and vendors are not to contact you directly. If they do, you should direct them to the district. Districts retain final determination of how tutoring programs are staffed. Sometimes people at private schools have experience in a Title I program, and a lot of times that is coming from a public school perspective. And I just want to talk for a moment about the difference between private school Title I programs and public school Title I programs. Most public school Title I programs are being operated at what they call a school-wide program, which is drastically different than a targeted assistance program. So what are the key features of a targeted assistance program? So students have to be eligible, and that's based on academic need. We have to show that the students who are receiving the services are the most academically needy, and we actually must serve students in order of academic need. All services must be supplemental based on a valid needs assessment. So by supplemental, that goes back to that students must receive all the core instruction and or any other content services, support services that a site offers before we can access federal Title I services. In this case, it is controlled by the district. The district is responsible for retaining control of the funds and providing program services. And because this is a district program, final decisions rest with the district. Families must be made aware that students are participating in a Title I program provided by the district or districts. Students enrolled in a Title I program must have that signed permission form. And here is an address to email that to. Program assessment and evaluation must be directly related to student achievement. And sometimes we get questions about well-rounded. Schools in the past have asked about counseling. That has pretty much died away in recent years, but I do want to talk about it. I just want you to know that if those services were desired and could be prioritized and provided, it would only be for targeted eligible student based on their needs assessment. So you can understand why then it would be difficult to provide this kind of program. But if we were to do that, remember that in this context, the priority would be academic counseling, not socio-emotional counseling. Private schools may contact the Arizona Department of Ed State Ombudsperson for questions or appeal, and there is an email address, privateschoolsombud@azed.gov. And I would just ask that before you contact the ombudsperson, you contact your school district with any questions or concerns you might have. So Title I is the one fund that you could actually have private schools participating with more than one district, because these funds follow students and families. So because of that, sometimes because of their small group sizes and or limited funding, many sites like to combine student groups. So they would have one group of, let's say, second graders with eligible students from more than one district receiving services in a single group. That is often the best use of funds, because rather than having a program for each district with maybe one or two second graders in each district's group, you're able to combine those district students, and it makes your funding go a lot further, which also provides more services to students. So we encourage you to do that when possible. It's not required, but if we are doing that, it is important for the administrator of the private school to be aware what % of their funding is coming from each school district. And when you create collaboratively with the district, those student groups, that you keep those proportions, so the proportion of funding is equal to the proportion number of students from each district. So in other words, if Tucson Unified is providing 70% of the funding, then 70% of the students receiving tutoring, assuming the lengths of tutoring are the same for all groups every week, should be TUSD students. Once groups are determined to be the appropriate mix related to funding, student switches may only be made within the district. In other words, Tucson Unified students may only be exchanged for other Tucson Unified students. Sunnyside students can only be exchanged for Sunnyside students, and Amphi students may only be exchanged for Amphi students. This will make sure that the funding stays intact and that students can receive as many services as possible equal to their peers throughout the year. Some schools really want summer school, and again, even though Arizona Department of Ed and Department of Ed strongly discourage us to have summer school every year, a lot of times we do have summer school. If you are a school that wants to plan for a summer school, know that those formal summer school plans must be submitted to Tucson Unified School District no later than December 19, 2022. That plan must include all details, including the dates of your program, the daily schedules, so what days of the week and what times of the day are groups meeting, what are the grade levels and content, and what times within that day are each of those contents being held, and the proposed number of students in each grade content level. All services must be received on or before June 30th. Well, as unpopular as it is, we all know that COVID-19 is still part of our landscape, as are monkeypox and polio. All federal activities managed by Tucson Unified School District must follow Tucson Unified District guidance as a minimum, or whatever rules TUSD has in place at the pertinent time. So, for example, if there is a mask mandate in place for Tucson Unified School District staff and students, that mask mandate will translate to being in place for Tucson Unified School District programs and services, even though they may be being held at private school sites. Likewise, I also ask my tutors and vendor tutors to abide by the protocols that are in place at the private schools. So if a private school has a mask mandate, even if TUSD does not have one, we are always subject to the most restrictive policy that is in place, and we ask all those tutors and vendor tutors to abide by those same community rules. Well, I don't think I can say it enough, but I'm going to say it again. All resources purchased with federal funds remain under the control of the districts managing those program resources, and they must be used for their intended purpose based on a current needs assessment. While this is true for all federal programs, we are really talking about inventory here. Many resources have been purchased using ESSER and Title IV, but we also have Title I resources out there, and to that end, we provide all private schools a list of their federal inventory annually. We ask schools to report the location and condition of inventory every year. It is tagged with Tucson Unified School District information. Every other year, we are required to conduct a physical audit of inventory, and we always do that in the even years. Also important to know is that federal assets may never be repaired, modified, or disposed of by private schools, even if they are completely destroyed, flooded, or caught on fire. Lost, damaged, or stolen assets are to be immediately reported. Tucson Unified School District will then commence with the district protocols regarding missing or damaged assets, and we will also pick up assets that are no longer of use to the school. So even if they're not damaged or lost, if they are no longer being used for their intended purpose or of no longer of use to you, you must notify us and we will come and reclaim those assets. So I want to talk about carryover for a moment. And for those of you who don't know what carryover is comes from funds that are remaining after June 30th of the school year. So perhaps the school didn't get a chance or the opportunity to expend all their funds. Their program wasn't large enough or long enough to expend all the funding. Well, federal and state departments of education expect all federal funds to be spent in the year they are allocated, to the benefit of the students and staff during that year. Schools and LEAs must budget and expend in the current year. In April of 2022, I did receive some updated draft guidance from Department of Ed proposing some changes to private school carryover. So I do want to let you know part of the context of this is that in January of 2020, Department of Ed rolled out some changes regarding carryover for Title I, and basically what they said is that if a private school had not expended all of their Title I funds, that the district must carry them over for the private school in the next year. That was largely due to the idea that many private schools were not receiving equitable services in a timely manner from districts, that districts were not providing information or access. So to kind of curb that, Department of Ed came out with that. And then there was never a rule about that regarding Title II and IV. However, in Arizona Department of Ed, because there was not any formal guidance regarding 2 and 4, they assumed that that was true for 2 and 4 as well. And so for the last couple of years, private schools who've requested it have been granted 100% of any carryover that exists. So the problem with that is that carryover that exists for private schools can take program services away from district students. And I think that what has happened in the subsequent 2 years since 2020, the federal government has received a number of complaints and is starting to realize, oh, there are a lot of districts that really are trying to provide these services, and in many cases, private schools are not taking advantage of them or providing information in a timely manner, etc. So the draft guidance that came out in April basically delineates when private school carryover would be allowed and under what conditions and how that would be handled. Because the bottom line is that the state and the federal government believe that the only reason there would be any funding left is if there was a failure on the part of the district to provide requested services and planned activities, or there's a delay for some reason. That is, it's basically no fault of the private school. It is something that's out of their hands. So this new guidance kind of specifically lists out kind of two major categories. One is like if there's a natural disaster or a program delay. So in the year of 2020, in the spring, obviously COVID-19 was a program disruption. or the inability or failure of a district to use all available funding to provide requested or planned activities, kind of going back to that idea that the school asked for things and the district never provided them. If a private school applies for carryover for these circumstances, and Arizona Department of Ed determines that it is going to allow carryover because it is Arizona Department of Ed who approves those applications, whatever carryover is in there goes to the affected private school. The other category is more the things that the districts have always said, no, we tried to provide services, but there were things that came up. Those things could be that services were received, but they cost less than were budgeted or anticipated. So the school got all 1,000 hours of tutoring that it asked for and had time for, but they cost less. Or the private school decides not to participate in planned activities. You can't ask for carryover if you've decided you're not going to do that. Or along those same lines, if a district and school agree there are no additional needs. And so this is where I want to make sure that everybody understands that if you fail to request your activities in a timely manner according to communicated timelines or fail to give the district information that it needs, from a district perspective, that translates to no additional needs. If carryover is approved for these circumstances, then the carryover is granted to the general pool of funds and it is then distributed out to both district and private schools. Significant difference. So here in the first column, if there were $1,000 of carryover because of a natural disaster, all $1,000 of that goes to the private school that was affected by that natural disaster. In the second column, if there's $1,000 left over, but it's because the private school failed to request activities or provide information in a timely manner, now that $1,000 goes back into the general pool and it gets divided by the 31,000 students, not the 1,000, not just provided to the private school. So you can see that it's a significant difference. I'm going to talk just for a second about how carryover works. So carryover requests are made directly to Arizona Department of Ed, and part of that request includes narrative regarding the reasons for the carryover. They say, why does this carryover exist? And they are also going to ask us what we're going to do going forward to make sure this doesn't happen again. On that form, there is a place for the private school to tell their reasons why the carryover exists, and there's a place for the district to provide information about what their belief is about why the carryover exists. From that, then Arizona Department of Ed will make a determination about whether or not they're even going to grant the carryover. If the carryover is granted or allowed, it must be expended in exactly the manner that is outlined in that request form. So schools must plan in detail how approved carryover would be spent. This is part of the carryover request narrative. Please know that carryover is not likely to be approved until January or February of 2023. So this is past the TUSD capital deadline, so any capital critical to your program could not be requested using carryover, which is not really applicable to Title I. But I do think it's applicable in that when you think about your program, depending on why your carryover from the prior year, if any, exists, you really want to consider why does that exist and then kind of plan your program around that. So maybe the idea would be, well, you know, we didn't request all the hours or we didn't provide the district all the access to students that we would have needed to provide to use all of this funding, but we're going to ask for it and see if we can run a summer program with it. But in the meantime, we're going to plan to spend all of our Title I funding in the way that it's designed to be early in the year. So this really concludes the basic nuts and bolts of the Title I program. If you are participating in a Title I program with TUSD, student selection and program information was due August 22nd. Obviously, if you've not turned that in, it is late, but we will still take it because we still want to run a program for your students. We are available to consult with you. We have a private school mailbox, privateschools@tusd1.org. Private schools may contact Arizona Department of Ed for questions or appeal. There's the address. And again, I'm going to ask that you contact us first. The other thing I want to let you know is that the project technical specialists in the private school office of TUSD, there are 2 of them, really are the people who do all the paperwork and try to get all that work done on the ground. So if you hear from myself or either one of those individuals, you really need to respond because they are the people who are making sure that all the work and the paperwork that we need to have is getting through the system. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I want to thank you for listening to this presentation today.